Dr. Ellenson is not here yet, but the first part of our session tonight is Rabbi Sussman, who will be picking up the theme specifically following this earlier session this afternoon with the focus on Isaac Mayer Wise. Tonight we're going to begin first with Lat Sussman's reflections on David Einhorn, and again our theme being our founders, radical visionaries, and moderate pragmatists. So we started this conversation this afternoon with David Ellenson, who very skillfully wove elements of both themes together. Tonight, Lance will continue with his own focus on Einhorn's role in the shaping of our movement in the 19th century. And then, when David returns, we're going to have that much anticipated dialogue between the two of them as the successors to these two founders. We're going to first begin, I'm going to ask Dr. Nadia Saritsky, as of today, our longtime society board member, Associate Rabbi of Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation, to open our session tonight. She will be moderating, and we will ask her to share a word or two of her own personal reflections, and then she in turn will introduce our main speaker, Rabbi Lat Sussman.
I am honored and excited to be able to be here and to learn and to be able to be part of what I believe is a truly historic moment for the Reform movement as we expand our vision of how Reform Judaism can live on into the next century and beyond. And it's so amazing to hear some of the ways in which these radical visionaries, we were blessed, a lot of us who were here earlier, to how they spoke, and they had the courage to stand up for what they believed in and to speak for the future and to claim that prophetic voice, which is one of the reasons why I personally have been so drawn to classical Reform Judaism. Classical Reform Judaism to me is not a historic entity. It is a living and breathing entity. It has grown, and I am blessed to be part of it as one of the founding board members of the Society of Classical Reform Judaism. Its emphasis on the ethical principles, its unconditional embrace of interfaith families, its emphasis on removing obstacles to worship, removing obstacles to joining community, but rather its open embrace, its emphasis of the ethical over the ritual, all of these elements that were inspired by our founding teachers and our prophets from yesteryear, all of those values and principles are part of what I think will help us to address the future, to ensure that Reform Judaism remains a living, breathing, and relevant option for families of the future, for individuals of the future, for people of all walks who are searching for meaning, that we can claim that vision, that prophetic vision, and we can work to make of this world one where the Messianic era will be shared by all, that we will work on together. So I'm excited to hear from Rabbi Dr. Lat Sussman, who will help us learn a little bit more about how these radical ideas shape the past so that we can then in turn be inspired by them to move forward into the future.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Little technology, and hopefully it will be okay. Yeah. Good. Alrighty. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you to Howard and the Society for inviting me, and to everyone in the college community who is here. It is good to see you, and it's certainly good to be back here. To a certain extent, I guess I take that idea of being a successor to Einhorn seriously. Let me explain that. When the possibility came up of taking the pulpit at Kenesth, Israel, where I've now served for almost 13 years, and I received a call from the Rabbinic Placement Commission, that my family quickly called the Rabbinic Displacement Commission. I said, wow, KI, I mean, you know, we had Bert Korn there, was an American Jewish historian, and way back there was David Einhorn, who was the first and leading rabbinic voice against slavery. I thought that would be a good thing for me to step into that pulpit. It's not the same congregation anymore, but it was certainly a part of why I was attracted to the pulpit. Einhorn did leave Philadelphia, so he did not stay around to become emeritus, but one of the previous rabbis did address all of his successors, and that was Dr. Joseph Krauskopf, who one day I would urge you to take up in your studies and your travels. He is an important figure in the history of American Reform Judaism, very much in the classical tradition. As a matter of fact, he did not use the Union Prayer Book because it was much too traditional for him. And I know he influenced Dr. Michael Cook's work and others. So it's a name to remember, Joseph Krauskopf. I believe if you translate it into English, it means Joseph the Curly Head. So it'll be easier to remember. Very important, very energetic rabbi. He left an ethical will, and his ethical will was directed to many different people in his lives. The usual beginning, I've been a rabbi, so I don't have much of material wealth to leave for you, but I do have things I need to share with you. And there was a paragraph in the ethical will that said, to all my successors at Knesset Israel, make sure you love this congregation, because that's what they need and want from you. And I have to tell you, when I read that, it pierced me. It was very strong. He had served them long and well, and it's something all of my colleagues hopefully will have some experience like that, where somebody will give them that counsel. It's important to be a good speaker. It's important to be a good administrator. They want your heart the same way you want their hearts for Judaism. I can't imagine David Einhorn would have ever left instructions like that. He was much more cerebral and combative. But so I do have a sense of being part of a Shalshelet HaKabbalah, being part of a tradition. And as the current senior rabbi at KI, and being interested in American Jewish history, I thought it would be important to look into the rabbinic history of KI, and because Howard invited me to give this talk, I now am able to test my PowerPoint on you before I bring it home to the congregation. So we're going to learn a little bit about David Einhorn. He wears all types of labels, radical and this and that, foundational in American Reform Judaism. Let me walk you through his life through pictures. I happen to love making PowerPoints, and I have several dozen of these lectures now put together. And then you'll decide, as you've already heard today, the landscape is complex. There are many nuances to what 19th century Reform Judaism looked like here in this country and in Germany, and he bridges both. There is a hidden message in this title, Let My People Go, Rabbi David Einhorn and the Shaping of 19th Century Reform Judaism. The obvious message is slavery, since he was an outspoken and truly courageous abolitionist, and there you see his face imposed in a scene of a slave being beaten. But Let My People Go might have another meaning with respect to David Einhorn. So think about that, and we'll get to that as we go. Okay. Anybody know how to make this work? No. What does that mean? Does anybody know what that means? It means use the right click. So, like so many of the Reform rabbis of the mid-19th century here in America, Einhorn comes from Germany, from southern Germany. He comes from a little town called Diesbeck, and if you look on the map there, you can see it's kind of northwest corner of today, which would be Bavaria or probably Middle Franconia if you get very specific. And it was a typical little village. Please understand that at this time, the vast majority of German Jews lived in little villages. The urbanization was just beginning. And these villages, not unlike villages in Alsace, we're okay, it was right click, thanks Al. Villages further to the east in the districts that were a combined Polish and German, Poznan and other places. This is where Jews lived. They lived in villages, and the villages were quite traditional. So hey, David made it, very good. I was hoping that you would be really late and I wouldn't have to worry about any challenges later, but okay, it's good to see you anyway. Welcome back, long day. So we just started, it's the first official slide. The little village where our Rabbi David Einhorn came from. And he's born in the time, of course, that Napoleon had conquered Germany, and the Jewish community was greatly disrupted. The French were very heavy-handed in reorganizing religious communities, including the Jewish community. So just as in the north, there's now going to be a consistory here. It's a very complex situation. Einhorn left his village and studied at the Rabbinic School in Fürth, which is near Nuremberg, later destroyed, as you can see, during the Holocaust. These are old medieval communities. As a matter of fact, my own family came from a nearby set of villages and cities in Oberfranconia, in the northern part of Bavaria. Today, there is a Jewish museum in Fürth, as there are in many places throughout Germany. And from there, he went on to study for a Ph.D., causing a tremendous split between himself and his teachers back at the yeshiva. He was an extremely bright student, basically a prodigy. They had great hopes for him. The faculty of the yeshiva in Fürth, where he went, were traditionalists. They resisted change. They resisted what was happening across Europe as elements of the French Enlightenment began to challenge the old Jewish way. And Einhorn, who was a master, he was a Yodea Sefer, he was a Talmud Hacham, he knew the rabbinic literature inside and out. He breathed it. As a matter of fact, when you read his sermons, it's filled with allusions to rabbinic literature. He was literate. He was a literate rabbi, and it's one of the reasons he looked down on Isaac Mayer Wise, whose background is less clear. David asked earlier about what was his level of certification. I'm going to take Einhorn's side on this just for fun. Isaac Mayer Wise definitely was certified to teach kindergarten. There's no question. He had at least enough credentials in the German system to teach kindergarten. So, But as Woody Allen once said, the only difference between his writing and Dostoevsky is that Dostoevsky did not have the benefit of a good education. Okay? But Einhorn did have a good education at the yeshiva level, where he excelled, and then he went to various German universities, all in southern Germany, and either obtained a full Ph.D. or the European version, which is very difficult to achieve, or just below it. There is a little question. There's no biography yet on Einhorn. His son-in-law Kohler wrote about a 50-page article in the CCA yearbook, and that's what we're living with. And the reason we don't have a full biography, although he left a trail with printed letters, with printed writing, his handwritten information is impossible to decipher. I learned the word studying for the SATs, dysgraphia. This man suffered from terrible dysgraphia, and trying to discern his handwritten correspondence is nearly impossible. Today there are young German scholars, particularly at the University of Munich, who have become interesting in him. And one of them, a friend of mine, told me for 1 year, he had perfect handwriting. He broke his arm, and one of his daughters wrote all of his letters. So he finishes rabbinic school, and he finishes the university, and he begins to espouse some reform, or let's call them reformistic ideas, and from the beginning, out of the gate, he runs into trouble with the government. Now, unlike here in the States, as we heard earlier today from Dr. Ellenson, in Europe you have a statist model. It's not just, you have separation of church and state, our very confusing system. Try explaining it to somebody who doesn't live here. You have a theocracy like you have in Iran, where religion runs the country, and then you have statism, where the state runs religion. And that's the situation in Germany. Not only then, now as well. The state is very much involved, even more so in France. And he was not approved. He was not approved for a rabbinic position because some of the things he had said, theologically speaking, bothered the government, and they made a direct correspondence, which isn't entirely wrong, that if you're going to be liberal on religion, you're probably going to be liberal in politics. And they did not want that to go forward. This is a period of dark reaction from a statist point of view in Europe. He does get an appointment all the way over on the western border. Here's a picture of the synagogue at Birkenfeld. You can see it's a very modest position. And here he is, a fully musmach, ordained Orthodox rabbi with a doctorate after studying in several major universities, and he gets a very small pulpit. This is a big, powerful brain of a person, and he has a fairly rough career. It's a fairly rough career because he wants to get his message out. That's his psychology. Okay? He jumps in to the controversies involving the community in Breslau, where later you get the first Jewish theological seminary. Today, Breslau is, if I can say it right in Polish, something like Wrocław, and it's in western Poland. In this period, it was among the eastern provinces of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as you all know, wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire. But it was under the control of German authorities, later Prussian authorities, and they were looking to Germanize. They were looking to Germanize. Nobody has really studied, so far as I know, what the difference is between the German Jews who came from these eastern districts and the German Jews who came from the southern part of Germany. I have a hunch, but that's it. They were talking about a much more traditional group of people coming from the east. Since the state controlled religion, you had a single community, a single Gemeinde, as they called it, which meant that Reform and Orthodox would have to work side by side if they both got the approval of the state. However, in Breslau, the senior rabbi, the Landsrabbiner, was Gedalia Tickton, and he was uncomfortable working with a person we had heard about earlier today, Abraham Geiger, who, if anybody is the, quote, father of Reform Judaism, and especially classical Reform Judaism, it was Geiger. This was, like Einhorn, and maybe more so, a fully trained Talmudic scholar with a legitimate Ph.D. from German universities and could write authentically based on language and text in a number of different topics. Geiger was formulating Reform ideals, both theologically and ritually, and it made it impossible for him to work with Tickton, and it turned into a very nasty fight. Einhorn joins the fray. One thing we'll learn about Rabbi David Einhorn is he wasn't afraid of a fight. He was perfect to come to America before the Civil War. Fit his personality perfectly. As many of you know, there is a two-volume series on the sources of Reform Judaism, the rise of Reform Judaism and the growth of Reform Judaism, that had been, I believe, published originally by the World Union for Progressive Judaism. I just actually heard from the president of JPS, who's a Reform rabbi, that they're planning to republish these two books, which is wonderful news. And there's a third volume updating by Dr. Meyer here. So Gunther Plaut, who edited these, the late and wonderful Gunther Plaut, has this document that Einhorn gave an opinion in a response to the issues going on in Breslau as to whether or not Geiger had a right to speak his mind and tell the truth as he understood it. The question was, does a rabbi forfeit his right to occupy his post when he departs in some respects from biblical interpretations and traditionally valid rules of the Talmud, and if so, under what conditions? In other words, is Reform kosher? And that particular issue of the Talmud is going to come back up here in the States as well. Einhorn's answer: one cannot deny the name Jew, nor his fitness for the rabbinic post, to one who objects to the kind of authoritarianism which would make Judaism an unreplenished swamp and condemn it to eternal stagnation. Here is a moderate man looking for common ground. We must not ascribe such infallibility and apotheosis to the Talmud. Okay? We believe in its validity, but at the same time we must reject its deification and say to it, Israel believes you, but not in you. You are the channel of the divine, but not divinity itself. Okay? We have a right, based on our understanding of Scripture, to continue the interpretation of Judaism as we see fit for our time. These here are fighting words. Okay? Now, he fights on behalf of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger. At the same time, he turns his attention to the West, to Frankfurt, where there is a big fight going on in the Jewish community there. There is a Reformverein, a Reform society, made up entirely of laymen who are willing to have reforms, modifications in their religious life beyond what Geiger and Holdheim and Einhorn themselves were saying, throwing lots out, that they were just going to basically Germanize the Jewish religion, and Einhorn takes exception to them. He says there are limits. You have to have principles and beliefs, and it's too far. So now he finds himself between a more radical form of Reform Judaism and tradition. Because of that, he mostly viewed himself as a centrist. He was not the most radical. He was not the most radical. He took exception to the most radical because he didn't really believe it was based on principle. It's during this period, as we heard earlier, that he married. He marries Julia Ox and has 9 children. 9 children, 5 daughters and 4 sons. One of his daughters, Johanna, marries Kaufman Kohler to the far right, and another daughter, Matilda, marries Emil Hirsch, who we heard so much about. And they become basically an aristocratic Reform Jewish family. You have 3 of the greatest Reform rabbis of the 19th century around one Seder table. It's absolutely remarkable. The Hasidim have no monopoly on dynasty. Okay. Einhorn is among those German rabbis who go to the great conferences of the 1840s with Geiger and Holdheim and others, Ludwig Philippson in attendance, trying to formulate a rationalized system for Reform Judaism. I believe that Einhorn is at 2 of them. Isaac Mayer Wise claimed to be at 1, at least stood in the back for 5 minutes and left. We don't have any other evidence about it. He's not in any of the roll calls or anything else. There's also a problem with his Ph.D. from the Charles University in Prague. He might have audited a continuing education class or something like that. But you know, when you come to America, you can reinvent yourself. So as my teacher, Dr. Marcus, said, he doctorized himself, he rabbinized himself, and nobody called him out on this because about every other rabbi was doing the same thing, so what was the point of criticizing? Einhorn, on the other hand, was the real deal, and he was there at these conferences, which are absolutely formative in the history of Reform Judaism in the 19th century. This is where the different currents are brought together, and the finest minds in Germany are in attendance. In America, Reform is still tiny. You have a small group in Charleston. You have a small group in Baltimore and 1 in New York. That's it in America. In America, Reform really doesn't blossom until after the Civil War. The brains of Reform were in Germany. The different tendencies, the different style prayer books were in Germany, and Einhorn, although not particularly successful in the pulpit, was one of the stars in these debates. Rabbi Samuel Holdheim, and we heard that he was associated ideologically with Holdheim by Dr. Pedachowski, was the rabbi all the way up north in Schwerin-Mecklenburg in Germany, and Holdheim follows him, which is good because Holdheim was radical. In fact, he was more radical than Einhorn because he was a Sunday preacher, and he allowed for officiation at mixed marriage. Einhorn did not do either of those. So yet again, he is way shy of being the radical fringe of Reform, and then Holdheim, of course, goes to Berlin. Okay. During this period, Einhorn, and this was already present at the conferences in Germany, gets involved in a controversy about Brit Milah. His opinion was the child of a Jewish mother is Jewish, whether or not the child is circumcised at 8 days or whenever. Okay? He also stated that for a male to convert to Judaism, they did have to have Brit Milah. But his decision to say a child did not have to have Brit Milah caused a big stir. And a non-Jewish Christian Hebraicist actually brought heresy charges against Einhorn for this. Okay? This controversy, I can tell you as a congregational rabbi, is not over. All the time I have parents coming to me and saying, do we really have to have a circ? Do we really have to have a circ? And the same question, by the way, comes up with male adult converts. Okay, so do you require a male adult to go through circumcision? If you want to work on a responsum as a society, it might be an interesting question. Much of the public attention to Reform Judaism in Germany initially is over this question of how, or set of questions about Brit Milah. Einhorn receives a call to serve a Reform pulpit in Budapest on the Pest side of the river. And what is so confusing about this moment in his career is that the guy who served that pulpit before him was also named David Einhorn. Okay? Except he was much more radical than our David Einhorn. And there is some confusion in the literature between Einhorn 1 and Einhorn 2. Okay? So he doesn't even get a chance to be a rabbi in Budapest because the Habsburg government hears that he is a troublemaker. So they shut him down. And he's stuck there basically with nothing to do. So he's got to do something, so he starts writing. And what does he write? He writes his prayer book, Olat Tamid, for the congregation that he doesn't have. Okay? And he begins to write a text, a philosophical text, of his philosophy of Judaism. Only one volume, I believe, came out, The Principles of Mosaism. His way of referring to Judaism was Mosaism. Remember that little fight he had about the Talmud? Mosaic Judaism, that's from God. Talmud, Midrash, that's later and understandable, but doesn't really have authority. Okay? So he now has a little bit of time to work, and he does so. And he writes this book, Das Prinzip des Mosaismus. Pure monotheism came not only from Sinai, but it was the original religion of mankind. It preceded Sinai. Okay? When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were monotheists. Judaism is the true religion of the world. It is the religion of God. At Sinai, Jews become the chosen people who are the guardians of this true monotheism, or the Goyim. What is the mission of Israel? It is to serve as a light to the nations. History, the goal of history, is for us to carry the banner of monotheism to the end when everybody else will be with us. I was talking to a friend of mine who taught at Binghamton University, and he said, I guess that means we should all stay Jewish to everybody else is Unitarian. Okay? In history, the Torah Sheba'al Peh seems to be the activating agent for reason. He is influenced by, and I'll show you their names, but I cannot really explain exactly the connections. Part of it is because the philosophers changed their name in contemporary German philosophy, kind of a late generation idealism, that the destruction of the temple and the Jewish state was liberating. We mentioned before Einhorn reversing Tisha B'Av's meaning. It's a liberation so that Judaism can pursue its universal goals. Okay? And then finally, later on, he rejects some contemporary doctrine, as, by the way, Isaac Mayer Wise did. Darwin, we're not monkeys, advanced monkeys, and biblical criticism, although he did try to serve in the community of Wellhausen, which is kind of ironic. Yeah, right. Okay? Here's just a dramatic picture about the destruction of the temple. We know that happened twice. And in, again, Plout's book, I'm sorry the number moved there, but The Rise of Judaism. Reform recognizes in the flaming Temple Mount not a curtailment, but rather a continuation of the divine work of salvation, which had begun on flaming Sinai, good flames and bad flames, marking the real beginning of the priestly mission, the conveyance of the divinity to all children of this earth, for which Israel has been ordained at the Sinaitic choice, brackets, of Israel. Okay? We are called to be a light to the nations, to carry the banner of true religion of monotheism. He is influenced by the intellectual discourse of his time, by Fichte and Hegel, and many of the people who write about him talk about the influence of Schelling on him. The problem with Schelling is I can't find anybody who agrees as to what Schelling said. Apparently, he wrote one book and he went one way and another way. I'm not at all rooted in that literature. The point is that he was very much tied to current philosophical and historical developments in Germany. One quote from Schelling at that time: "History as a whole is a progressive, gradually self-disclosing revelation of the absolute," which is a little bit dense to unpack. I'm glad it's in English. But if you think about this idea of progressive revelation, and this is the nature of discourse, this unfolding, this progressive revelation, not just of Torah, but of history itself. Okay? He is part of that world of thought. He comes to America in 1855. Not well-known picture by Felix Schlesinger here. Prussian mail freight office with Jewish immigrants. It's hard to find pictures. East European Jews, it's easier. At this time, it had become possible to cross the Atlantic in a much easier fashion than earlier. Not that many Jews are in this country before the War of 1815, but when the British stopped harassing American boats, when steam transportation enters, when the American economy demands foreign labor, immigration picks up, and as we heard, massive numbers of Germans in general come to America, and embedded in them are many, many Jews, raising the Jewish population here to 150,000. In the mix are a number of people who help form Reform Judaism in America. Isaac Mayer Wise, Max Lilienthal, David Einhorn. It's a long, long list. In fact, Reform Judaism in America did pretty well in terms of the immigration of rabbis here to the United States. He comes to serve a congregation first in Baltimore called Har Sinai, which is one of the original Reformed synagogues, and a synagogue founded to be Reformed. Although he loved certain aspects of America, he was also somewhat ambivalent about America. It was not a complete love affair. It's not that he didn't see the warts, so to speak, on the body politic here. He loved America, he loved Lincoln, but he hated slavery, which he viewed as an extension of American materialism, the idea of turning a human being into a financial asset. He detested what he considered to be many of the phony religious leaders in this country. You can put, for example, Isaac Mayer Wise, and ultimately viewed his native German as the language of culture and spirituality, from which he was not willing to break himself. He was a resistor. So he comes to Baltimore in 1855. The picture of the stained glass there is not from Har Sinai. It's actually a predecessor of the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, today known as the Lloyd Street Synagogue. And as best we know, it's from the 1840s. It is the first depiction of a six-pointed star in an American city. Baltimore was an important port, and culturally and politically, I would say, within the South. It's just below the Mason-Dixon line. From his inaugural address at Har Sinai, above all, Judaism should be thoroughly Jewish, based on divine revelation. He believes in revelation. In our day, we cannot lay too much stress on this point. The more mere ceremonialism loses its significance and observance, the more it is necessary for us to seize upon the essential character of the Jewish faith. We have to concentrate on the belief in the one and only God. Another quote: thoroughly Jewish, inspired by divine revelation, should our conduct be. Our whole life should breathe a reverence for the Holy One. This was a God-intoxicated man. Even the religious symbols, such of them as still have soul in them, meaning some don't, some religious idea, let's say, they shall be holy to us. Okay? He's not throwing all ritual out. What he's looking for is a way to glorify God. What are the goals of Jewish education? Now, the picture is anachronistic twice. Once, by the way, the artist did it, and secondly, because it's set in a much earlier time frame. It's a depiction of German Jewish life many, many years earlier by Oppenheim. What is the goal of Jewish education? So think about your religious schools. What would you write as a mission statement? In his inaugural, he writes, "The religious training of our children should be thoroughly Jewish and instinct with the spirit of the Sinaitic teaching." Okay, it's Mosaism. This is a task of supreme importance, a task to which we should bend every effort. We will point out to our children the world-redeeming power, the ever-widening significance of this Sinaitic teaching, which is ever-enduring, the changeable character of its outward forms, the glorious triumphs it has achieved outside the house of Jacob. And we will also point out the universal union of nations in God, the end for which Israel was set apart for the rest of mankind. We need to be Jewish because we are carrying the banner for all of humanity. For all of humanity. This is not Jewish survivalism. This is not personal spirituality. This is a mission, a commissioned mission to save the world. He arrives here just as a group of rabbis are meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, in which a truce is trying to be brokered by Isaac Leeser of Philadelphia, who is the nominal leader of the traditional camp, the majority of American Jews at the time in 1855, and Isaac Mayer Wise, who was leading the charge on the still pretty small reform movement. And they try to work out a peace accord between them, and there were several other rabbis there as well. The sticking point was the question, the same question you've heard Einhorn address earlier. What is the level of authority of the Talmud? Okay, and we know what he said already. He was not present. He was just getting off the boat. But when he heard what was going on, he quickly issues a statement, a broadside, across the land, attacking Isaac Mayer Wise for caving. That this is not what Reform Judaism is. He had heard that Wise was going to agree to Leeser's terms on the Talmud and its authority. It destroyed the conference. Everybody had to go home. Chances of unity in American Jewish life on religious grounds have not been much different ever since. Okay? They had their little civil war 6 years early. He brought with him, apparently from Europe, his Olat Tamid. I couldn't believe the day I was invited to speak here at the college that the portion starts about the Olat. It was just, you know, talk about Einhorn on the Parsha of Tzav was pretty amazing. And you've seen pieces of it. The original book was half German, half Hebrew. It includes unpointed Hebrew instruction. By the way, at different times in his life, he does favor day school education. He does favor Hebrew education. How are you supposed to read and be inspired by the tradition? He removes references to the resurrection of the dead, to the priesthood, which we talked about so much this morning. It did not win as much favor as Wise's Minhag America, and he relented late in life to it being translated into English in 1872, although I'm not sure, although he blessed it, was that happy about it. Now we know that in the Union Prayer Book 1A, the version that actually sticks, that it is influenced very much, or at least to a degree, by Olat Tamid, the eternal sacrifice. So here's a prayer translated again by Gunther Plaut. O God, be merciful unto us, and give us thy blessing, Let thy face shine upon us, that we may, in steadiness of heart, walk in the ways of righteousness, and forsaking all other motives, cleave unto thee. Who needs devakut and chassidism? We have Einhorn. Thus who spakest of old unto our fathers, and taught them the law of true life, send to us today thine instruction, that the spirit of true wisdom and counsel, of might and courage, of understanding and insight be upon us. Thou in whose light we behold light, open our eyes to the manifold tokens of thy power, and incline our ears to listen to the glad tidings of thy peace, which ring out from the pages of Israel's wonderful career. So you're wondering where some inspiration came for those who follow. This is not the Union Prayer Book, but you can see both in terms, I guess, of literary quality, although remember it's in German, and some of the ideas that are packed into the statement that they are relatives in the same family of different generations. At the same time in Baltimore, like Isaac Merewise and like many other Jewish leaders of the period, he has his own journal. They call it a newspaper, but it's really a journal, a monthly. It looks like in book form, that he appropriately calls, given his Mosaic orientation, Sinai. This is the voice from Sinai, and it's filled with his opinions and other articles, including a translation of Kol Sachal, in which he finds a like-minded, it's not identical, but from the Italian Renaissance, precedent for his way of thinking about an emergent Judaism based on the Sinai experience. He makes common cause with his friend Rabbi Samuel Adler in New York at Emmanuel congregation, and they were, I guess, kindred spirits. Adler had hoped that his son Felix would be part of this dynastic wave that was developing in American Reform Judaism, but as we know, Felix went in his own direction and became the founder of the ethical culture movement. So you had Reform Judaism of the period, which was light on ethnicity, and then you add to it Felix Adler, who takes out the heavy theism of Einhorn. So what are you left with? There's no ethnicity, there's no God, you're left with ethical culture. Okay. On the question of slavery, Einhorn arrives here in 1855 and immediately begins speaking to the issue of slavery. We know that there are a handful of Jews on the ground who have gone over to the abolitionist side, but very, very few. If you push the clock back 20, 30 years, there were even little whispers of abolition in the South. But as the clock runs, that disappears. The Jewish community in the South is pretty much solid in favor of the institution of slavery. Jews in the North, like the general population, are split between Democrats and Republicans, the Republicans in different levels endorsing abolition. It's already, by 1855, a very heated debate in this country. There's a feeling that civil war would be difficult to ignore, and in fact, the general rate of immigration to America begins to decline. 1855 is about the end of the really heavy period of immigration as the debate over slavery heats up. And Einhorn jumps right in on this, even though his pulpit is in Baltimore. Even though his pulpit is in Baltimore. Okay? The Rabbinic Debate, as we heard earlier today, and is well known, really comes to the fore late in the game. The Jews waited a long time to get into this discussion with the famed or infamous discourse by a preacher, an English Jew in New York, by the name of here it says Reverend, but let's call him Rabbi Raphael, who gives a defense of biblical slavery, basically arguing that what's wrong with slavery in America is not slavery itself, but that it's not more biblical-like. And he also gives, as we heard, a genetic, we might say racist, argument on why Africans happen to be slaves in this country. And this blows the cover, and Jews now become involved more publicly in the debate over slavery on the heels of the war. The war is just about to start. Here's a translation from a text by one of his daughters, by Johanna. God created man in his image. This blessing of God ranks higher than the curse of Noah. A book which sets up the principle and at the same time says that all human beings are descended from the same human parents can never approve of slavery and have it find favor in the sight of God. A law which recognizes slavery in its present-day meaning, neither according to the conception of the institution of it, nor in its literal sense, and prescribes that the Hebrew after 6 years will not cease from serving as a slave, must, as a sign of shame, submit to having his ear pierced, considers no human being to be property. I can tell you about 25 years ago when I first started teaching in colleges, I taught a class in Bible at Binghamton University. It's when the young men were first beginning to wear earrings. And one of my favorite discussions was, I want to tell you what that earring means. It means perpetual servitude. A religion which spares the feeling of the animal mother, as the order regarding the bird's nest proves, leave the mother, certainly objects to having the human mother forcibly deprived of her child, breaking up slave families. The 10 Commandments, the first of which, I am the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, can by no means want to place slavery of any human being under divine sanction, even though it says slaves can rest on Shabbat, even though in the next parsha, in Mishpatim, it talks about Eved Ivri and the regulations of slavery. It being furthermore true, what all our prophets have proclaimed and around which Israel's fondest hopes center, that all human beings on the wide globe are entitled to the service of God, v'hishtachavu lechavenecha, kol habarim v'ya'asu kulam agudah achad, that in the time to come, all created in the image of God will form one congregation of God. It is tied to his teleological view that the original monotheism will ultimately be the monotheism of all humanity, not free and slave, but all free, recognizing the one God. Okay? He was a relentless critic of slavery. I'm sure for those of you who have raised children, you've had those moments when you're trying to get your child to be quiet, and they won't be quiet, so you gently try to cover their mouth, and they wiggle out, and they keep talking, and they keep saying what you don't want them to say. I imagine that's how the Balabatim of his synagogue felt about him. He would not relent. Importantly, some of his most important statements on slavery are titled The War on Amalek. He equates American materialism with Amalek, that this is the evil force in the world, to see a human being, and we have to fight back this impulse, this expression of Amalek. He comes out, no surprise here, on the side of the North, May 12, 1861. And it is deeply troubling to his synagogue. Not so much that it's a mix of religion and politics, even though they're mostly pro-South, but because he's putting everybody in danger. And this comes to a head, as Dr. Gary Zola said earlier, when a detachment of Union troops marching their way from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C., decide to walk through instead of around Baltimore, a pro-Southern city, and a riot ensues, known as the Pratt Street riot, Pratt Street being one of the big east-west boulevards in Baltimore, near the harbor, and there are casualties on both sides. They're literally, so to speak, cooking the tar now for Einhorn, because he is a northern sympathizer. He goes to Kenesth, Israel, in Philadelphia, which was founded in 1847, and right around this time begins to grow as a synagogue, actually is able to buy a rather impressive church building with a large sanctuary. And in Philadelphia, which is a very divided city. Remember, Philadelphia has a huge presence of Irish immigrants who are not interested in dying to free slaves. and there are significant problems, security problems in Philadelphia, continues still to talk against slavery. In our own synagogue, one of our member artists was inspired to make this poster, which is in our lobby, honoring the courage of Einhorn. Ernestine Rose was another Jewish abolitionist. She also hated religion, so it's a little bit harder. But in KI, I guess there's a place for her too. Okay. He was a great admirer of Lincoln. I thought, we read today some of his criticisms of Lincoln, but generally pretty mild. He deified Lincoln for all intents and purposes. How Abraham Lincoln loved the suffering fatherland. We should feel joy that such a great moral figure lived among us in our time, and that the history of this republic became enriched through another great name, that by the side of Washington, that name, Lincoln, now stands. He was a true admirer. Okay. Einhorn leaves Philadelphia in 1866 and moves to New York to serve Adas or Dat Yeshurun congregation. I was able to find a letter in our archives as to why he left KI. Basically what he wrote to the president was, not enough people are coming to hear my sermons. So I'm moving to the big city. But I think it was more than that. I think Adler, he had other friends in New York, and what can I tell you about that? When I moved to Philadelphia 13 years ago, I asked the husband of our president, I said, what is the best thing about Philadelphia? And he said, New York. So what can I tell you? His congregation will merge with Anshe Chesed over there on the right, and then it will become Temple Bethel, and Bethel in turn will merge with Emmanuel in 1927. So it becomes one of the great synagogues. After leaving Philadelphia, he comes back to Philadelphia for a conference. It's the first, the second rabbinic conference in America. The first one was in Cleveland that ended with no positive results in 1855. This is a meeting of Reform rabbis in November of 1869 in the home of Rabbi Hirsch, the father of Emil Hirsch, Rabbi Samuel Hirsch, formerly the chief rabbi of Luxembourg. It's good to be a big fish in a small pond. And he was the new rabbi of Kenesth, Israel, the successor to David Einhorn, and also a learned man with all the appropriate credentials. And this group meets to deal with some of the issues of the moment in Reform and to give their version of Reform, different than Wise's version of Reform out in Cincinnati, some definition here in the States, just as we saw the 3 conferences in Germany. There were actually many more than that. So just the first line of them, there's several points here. This precedes, by the way, and it's important to note this, before there was a Pittsburgh platform, there was the Philadelphia platform. This was really the first in many ways. The messianic aim of Israel is not the restoration of the old Jewish state under a descendant of David involving a separation of the nations, but the union of all the children of God in the confession of the unity of God. And 2, we look upon the destruction of the second Jewish commonwealth not as punishment for the sinfulness of Israel, but as a result of the divine purpose revealed to Abraham. Here's your Brit Avot, which has become ever clearer in the course of history, and again, it leads to this teleological goal. 3, the Aaronic, is that a word? I don't know how to say it. Priesthood and Mosaic sacrificial cult were steps to the real priesthood, Mamlechet Kohanim, of the whole people. So we are free of all these things, including kashrut. 4, every distinction between Aaronites and non-Aaronites, we're not going to call Kohen and Levi and Israel. There'll be no different. 5, the selection of Israel as the people of religion, as the bearer of the highest idea of humanity, is still as ever to be strongly emphasized. This is our world-embracing mission. Okay. We no longer believe in bodily resurrection. only the existence of the soul. 7, urgently as the cultivation of the Hebrew language, in which the treasures of divine revelation were given, and the immortal remains of a literature that influences all civilized nations are preserved, must always be desired by us in fulfillment of a sacred duty, yet it has become unintelligible to the vast majority of our co-religionists. Therefore, as is advisable under existing circumstances, it must give way in prayer to intelligible language, which prayer, if not understood, is a soulless form. So certainly he would not object to Reform Judaism in Israel being all in Hebrew. He's not Hebrew-phobic, but he's worried about the spiritual impact. You can make the case, as we heard, Kaddish's mantra, although it's not really Hebrew, most of it, can have an effect on people. He wants it with understanding. Okay? They passed a number of resolutions. Hirsch and Einhorn had a big fight over mixed marriage. Hirsch basically said it's okay for monotheists to marry, and they didn't agree, and it brought the conference to an end. It's even made its way into the newspapers. Now, when we talked about Hirsch earlier, remember, he is Samuel Hirsch's son and David Einhorn's father-in-law. So somehow he's going to have to praise both. And trying to figure out who he likes more, I'll leave that up to you. We're deep into family politics, so I think he's closer to his father. His very last sermon, July 12, 1879, Germany is my home. And this is from Dr. Meyer, so I hope I get this right. You're right here. Germany is my home. I am an Ivri, a wanderer, and I journeyed with thousands of my brethren from there to this God-blessed republic. I assume that's good. As proud as I am of my adopted citizenship, definitely, I will never forget that the old home is the land of thinkers, presently the foremost land of culture, and above all, the land of Mendelssohn, the birthplace of Reform Judaism. If you sever from Reform the German spirit, or what amounts to the same thing, the German language, you will have ever torn it from its native soil, and that lovely flower must wilt. So again, if you want to talk about what is the cultural basis of Reform, to him it is inseparable from the German language and culture. Passes away shortly thereafter, November 2nd, 1879, is a report of his funeral. He is buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in Queens, New York. And very quickly, the legend begins. The Pittsburgh platform, beloved by some, hated by others. There was actually a meeting of reconciliation in his lifetime, but Achrei Mod called Achrei Mod Kedoshim, right? After death, everybody is Kedoshim. It's a reference to 2 Parshiot in Leviticus. After death, they all become saints. And so the conference and others are able to gather around, as we have done, irreconcilable foes for the most part, and lump them all together and say, Kol Yisrael Haverim. The legend begins. As we talked earlier, UPB 1A, influenced by Olat Tamid, unlike UPB 1, 1892, helps through Kohler and others to continue the Einhornian tradition. So there you are, a little bit about David Einhorn, theologian, liturgist, social activist, and founder of Reform Judaism. Thank you.
I have a bunch of questions, but I'll ask the most relevant to today. So he keeps talking, you mentioned how universalism is so important and this acceptance, and yet he keeps saying that Judaism is to lead the nations to the true knowledge and worship of God. So how do those work together?
We are the vanguard. The Jews are the standard bearer of the original monotheism from creation, given again in pure form at Sinai, at least part of it in pure form. We're to carry it. It's too much for all of humanity until one day, I guess Isaiah the Goyim Naharu, the nations will stream to Jerusalem, so to speak. I don't know if he actually works that part of it out, and be under the same banner of Israel. The purpose of Israel, the reason for Jewish life, is to bear witness to the one and true God and bring humanity in some fashion to that God.
So ideally, everyone would be Reformed Jews?
Again, I like the way my friend phrased it to me. We have to stay Jewish until everybody else is Unitarian. In a book by Dr. Krauskopf, Joseph Krauskopf, he has on the Passion Play in Germany, he ends by saying, one day the Christian will give up Christ, and the Jew will give up his racial pride, and then we will just have God. So we keep the hope of humanity, one God, V'nei Amar. We sing the Farmer in the Dell at the end of services. That's part of that vision of a united humanity, all the truth. He had a saying, one truth uniting all of humanity. Truth uniting all of humanity. And that's our job, to show the way.
So we have that truth.
It's in the Torah.
Relevant to this question, and where I thought we might be going, in fact, is notwithstanding this, of course, he strongly opposed mixed marriage and would not appreciate
you must
mixed marriage,
oppose.
in part because the purity of the Israelite faith and mission, almost Yehuda Halevi-like. Do you have a sense of beyond how that is rationalized, if you will, in his ideology, where that also stands otherwise in his gut?
He was very much against mixed marriage. He believed in the election of Israel and that it couldn't be diluted. I think it was heartfelt. And I think it must have been his way of negotiating what he had lived through in terms of the enfranchisement of Jews in Europe, the necessity of giving up Jewish communal autonomy to whatever degree it was, and yet the need to preserve Jewish identity for a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
For a purpose. And this must have been, I guess, his way of negotiating that we're being set free to do our work among the nations, but our work isn't done. So in that sense, we have to stay together. Not as a nation, not as an ethnos, but as a believing community, Glaubgemeinde, or something of that nature. Dr. Meyer, do you want to help her?
There's a very famous phrase with Einhorn's that mixed marriage is the nail.
Nail in the coffin of
Yeah.
Judaism.
Yeah.
Mixed marriage is the nail, should have included that. Mixed marriage is the nail in the coffin of Judaism, because we'll not be able to continue forward the spiritual work of Israel. And you get the half the show now.
No, it's really fascinating. One of the interesting things about Einhorn, though, too, and these quotations don't completely show it, is that in virtually all the articles and books that he writes, as you well know, he cites lots of rabbinic sources.
Yes.
In other words, from reading this, you wouldn't necessarily be aware of that. So that, for example, take the position he took on Tisha B'Av, where Tisha B'Av, of course, is a great, great holiday to celebrate because the temple was destroyed and therefore we were dispersed into the world to fulfill our mission. He cites a passage from Pesachim 87b, which states exactly that Israel was dispersed, went into Galut, in order to bring the message of the one God to all humankind. In dealing with issues of authority in Judaism early on in his career, extremely, extremely long discussions of the Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder. Indeed, one of the interesting things about Einhorn is, as you've shown tonight, is actually how adept he was in rabbinic literature. He cites it actually all the time in his writings, and his knowledge is really quite thorough. I think the way I would understand how Einhorn might view it, I think the paradox is, on the one hand, Einhorn, Wise, all of these people believed in biblical revelation. And they did really believe in the notion of divine mission, as opposed to the Unitarian quip I think it actually is true. They thought that Judaism was nevertheless the religion of reason. I mean, to mix centuries here, but if you think even of Hermann Cohen, he really talks about the religion of reason, and then it's out of the sources of Judaism. People like Einhorn believed that Judaism genuinely embodied reason, and that all the world would one day come to recognize this, so that in one sense, I think they genuinely believed over against history, I think, that there might one day be a conversion of all peoples to...
At least monotheism.
At least to
But
monotheism.
the Jewishness then can be dropped at that point.
If it were to... I mean, and look, today, even the examples from his liturgy, he takes up the... I mean, he's quite a good Hebraist, even for the little bit of Hebrew he puts in his... puts in his prayer book, where he instantiates the notion of priestly mission of the entire people through the way in which he does the priestly blessing, where the entire community participates in blessing itself. Priests aren't the ones who do it. The Jewish people are the ones who do it. And finally, I mean, this whole issue of particularity, I think you mentioned today, it might have been Gary, I can't remember.
It all blends.
At this point, I mean, even if you think about people like Wise, one of my favorite set of documents is, of course, was it you or Gary who mentioned today when he appointed Ginsburg to the fact?
Oh, it was Gary.
It was Gary.
It was Gary. Oh, well, I mean, someone like Louis Ginsburg, greatest Talmudist in the world in his era, was appointed to the faculty here at the College Institute. And in an interview, he just uncovered, Isaac Mayer Wise, that, I mean, in effect, right before he was appointed, we have letters from the Board of Governors announcing his appointment to the faculty at HUC. And Wise just asked him, do you believe in the documentary hypothesis? And he went, well, of course. I mean, what is it you're asking me? And then Wise rescinded his appointment, and he ended up going to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he became head of the responsa committee, law committee for the conservative movement. I mean, these people were quite interesting, but I think they were genuine believers.
They were, yeah, at least a little bit. There's a core.
In this way.
Right, right. Not the total revelation,
No.
but there was a core revelation,
Of the
and it was
Pentateuch.
the truth. It was the absolute truth, yes.
If the goal is to make everybody into following the original religion, why would he be against mixed marriage? He should speed up the process by having all the Jewish girls marry non-Jews, and then all the children are brought Jewish because they are Jews by definition.
If they converted.
And then all the Jewish guys could get the women to become Jewish, and to speed up the process.
Samuel Hirsch might have, not quite that way, but would have been more comfortable with the union of different types of monotheists, because it's going toward that monotheistic goal. Einhorn, again, believed that the Jew needed to stay Jewish in a religious way until the work of the Jewish people was done. And then eschatologically, who knows what comes after that in the end of days. But we have work to do, and only we can do it. God chose the Jews at Sinai to carry the truth forward. So we have to stay together to carry that truth. When the job is done, we won't worry about what our identity looks like. Now, it's hard to say, I don't know of any Jewish group that thinks that way today, maybe Chabad to some extent, and they create B'nai Noach societies to try to move Gentiles away from whatever their religions are, so that they can at least not contradict the teachings of Torah.
I love Chabad and David Einhorn being brought together.
I mean, B'nai Noach would be acceptable, right?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, and I want to thank you, because I think that actually the fact that we're talking about Chabad and Einhorn together is one of the important ways in which we can find commonalities. So, but as we're, even though the evening is growing late, it's very important for us to be able to have an opportunity to hear from both of you in terms of how you see yourselves as the successors, and the ways in which these important values that obviously come from a certain historical context can shape where we as a movement can move forward. And there may be some particularities that may no longer speak to us, but there may be some underlying values that remind us of our own sense of mission and purpose as we enter into the 21st century. So it would be wonderful if, as a closing remark, I think one of the exciting things about this day is that we've been running late all through, which says that there's a lot to say, and this is a conversation that we've waited far too long to have. But if we can hear from you, we would be grateful.
In thinking of what I can glean and apply from, thank you, Nadia, apply from the world of David Einhorn to myself, for different reasons, I too work toward preserving Jewishness. And there isn't time, and this isn't really the occasion for me to explain myself. It's more emotional, psychological than it is in his case about, quote, bearing the truth. I feel that his model of rabbi doctor and raising the level of discourse in the synagogue is something we desperately need today. We don't need schmooze. We can schmooze other places. And it takes effort to raise the level of discourse and intellectual involvement in Judaism. And he insisted on that. And so I think I take that from him. And lastly, I wish I had a little more of his self-confidence to only speak the truth. In a congregational setting, it's complex with people and politics and governance. But somewhere, somehow, it's important for our movement to articulate what it really believes to be true in the deepest matters, And in that area, I think I'm okay in articulating to my group, my flock, so to speak, what I consider to be the most things, that which you cannot, with which you cannot negotiate. And so I take that from him. I went to KI in part because he had been the rabbi there. It's a romantic notion. It makes no sense. My wife couldn't understand it. I said, there's just something about somehow just being on the same list of a person who said, slavery is wrong, and anybody who disagrees with me is wrong. Because that's right. That's right. There isn't, what Isaac Mayer Wise said this afternoon, we read his stuff, is nonsense. Slavery is wrong. And there were very few people who could say that. He said it. So I'm glad to be a footnote down on the bottom of the paper where he is too.
Dr. Ellenson?
Okay. Well, I mean, I feel like I had a strong opportunity to speak this afternoon, but I actually would echo a lot of what Rabbi Sussman just said. I mean, frankly, if we're talking about Einhorn in particular, it's his particularism in part that genuinely appeals to me. He viewed Judaism in genuinely religious and not just ethnic categories, but his religious beliefs led him to champion the importance of Jewish particularity. And I think for those of us today who may not share completely his certitude in regard to theology, nevertheless, there is something for us as Reformed Jews to continue to explore in this. If there is no ought in our conceptions theologically, it does become difficult to note how particularity really can be justified or affirmed. So I think that's part of its heritage. At this juncture, frankly, the other way I would look at it is that, again, his commitment to a social justice agenda is something that I think remains a very significant part of our heritage as Reformed Jews in particular. I mean, exactly the way that Lance phrased it. I think back to my own experience in rabbinical school. My teacher, Dr. Bamberger, used to say that even if you were liberal, it was possible at times to take your own side in an argument. Which is a way to say that sometimes things are right or wrong. I mean, just autobiographically, I do remember in finishing my rabbinic thesis that I had written an interpretation, and Dr. Bamberger, Fritz Bamberger, who was my advisor, did not agree with my interpretation. And he said, you know, David, you love theory a great, great deal, and you created a construct here, but the text that you've used to support this theory, it was just wrong. And I said, you know, Dr. Bamberger, with all due respect, I think you are not really being open-minded. So I wouldn't say that my interpretation is the only one that's plausible, but I think it's a plausible one. And he was, as Michael Meyer could tell you, the embodiment of German Bildung. He said very politely, it is possible that I am not being open-minded, but to quote Lionel Trilling, I hope I'm never so open-minded that my brains fall out. So at that point with Dr. Bamberger, I thought, well, I'll offer a different interpretation of that text. I thought that was an effective way to say it. But the lesson that I derive from that is that there are limits, there are boundaries, and some things in quotes are right or wrong. I think that all of us who are liberals in religion are beset by doubts and uncertainties virtually all of the time. And the confidence, I think, as you phrased it, that a David Einhorn possesses, and the notion that in the end there really are boundaries as to what is or is not correct. It is interesting with the issue of slavery. You know, having grown up in Virginia in the 1950s and 60s, I mean, I remember I grew up with segregated schools. I remember very, very well separate water fountains, public facilities for colored and white. This whole argument over Abraham Lincoln that we saw between Isaac Mayer Wise and David Einhorn today, I think it's a very powerful and moving legacy that David Einhorn leaves us. I actually think that some of my own stances that I've taken, particularly in the dozen years I've been president of the college in relationship to any number of social issues, including in, issues of inclusion for gay and lesbian persons, has been very much the result of the experiences I had as a child, quite frankly, thinking about the exclusion and discrimination which blacks suffered in the world in which I grew up in. And frankly, as I became older, the examples of people like Einhorn. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to write a commentary on Parshat Mishpatim and what's called the Queries commentary. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Most of the writers in this commentary, which was published by New York University Press, are gay, lesbian, bisexual people, but there are a few heterosexuals, I think actually at least two, Elliot Dorff and myself, who wrote in it. But unlike Einhorn, whose views on Revelation I do not completely share, I do remember, or I think what I derive from him is the notion that truth and reason needs to be recognized, the notion of a critical Judaism that does affirm evolution of Jewish religious tradition, the question of, well, I depart from him with the notion of the sanctity of the first five books of the Bible. I do think it's a critical theory, but in there, I won't go through the entire argument, but part of it is based on the fact that I dealt with a Levitical passage about that describes homosexuality as an abomination. And I did depart in this instance from the writings of colleagues of mine, like Rabbi Brad Artson of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and other colleagues who attempt to reinterpret this passage in Leviticus to somehow say that it doesn't say what I think it clearly says. I'm quite happy to admit that, at least from my perspective, the Bible really does condemn homosexuality in that Levitical passage. I just don't know why I, as a liberal Jew, when I have such a strong sense of what's right or wrong in this issue, need contend that this is somehow the expression of divine will. I can read the work of an Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, a Catholic feminist theologian, in a book in memory of her. She once wrote, anything in Holy Scriptures that diminishes the humanity of another person cannot possibly be the true expression of God. I think Einhorn sort of teaches us that type of thing, and I'm happy not to read it to Leviticus, but I'm equally happy to say that I don't believe it's divine. I mean, here I depart from Einhorn's literalism, I would call it, fundamentalism in regard to the Bible, but I do think his sense that there really are borders and there are things that are right and wrong, I think can continue to inform us quite powerfully. The whole tradition of social justice, of which many of us in the Reform movement are quite proud, is actually not the legacy of Isaac Mayer Wise. It is much more the legacy of David Einhorn, Kaufman, Kohler, and others. Quite clearly, in light of my own views, there are elements of Jewish nationalism, to put it rather mildly, what's called Zionism, where I do not think I share the sensibilities of, and I think from a critical perspective, have us re-look at this and come to appreciate what many of the elements in this heritage are, even as, I suspect for all of us, as we would about virtually any expression of Judaism prior to ours, descent from other elements of it as well. And so for that, I genuinely thank you, and I want to thank Lance both for his beautiful and provocative Founders Day address today, and for this really outstanding presentation on Rabbi Einhorn's life. The last line that I would add, and it does deal with his particularity, I love his knowledge. I really love his knowledge. Part of what made studying the 19th century figures for me such a labor of love and passion is how much these people knew. I would never compare Geiger to Einhorn in terms of Wise to Einhorn. I would compare Geiger to Einhorn. I mean, one, as I said earlier today, I think one reason no one's ever written a biography of Geiger, I don't think anybody would know enough to be able to write about everything that Geiger wrote about with absolute expertise, from Judaism and Islam through absolutely everything else. But the reality is these were people who really quite literally, and maybe this would be my last word, they literally reformed the tradition. They knew the tradition intimately. They were able to affirm what it was that they believed in that tradition, and at the same time, they were able to recast it in brilliant ways. I think I'm beginning to articulate better. For those of you who were not here this afternoon, I showed parts of both Wise and Einhorn's liturgies. And some of the changes that Einhorn made were just absolutely brilliant liturgical expressions of underlying theological positions that he held. You cannot do that if you do not have a great deal of knowledge about what the tradition is. So to some degree, I think part of their heritage, maybe it's a different way of saying what you just said, is that these people knew an immense amount about the tradition. I think what's difficult for us in the 21st century is that these people had the blessing of having been raised with an immense amount of Jewish knowledge. And then they went out into a larger world and were able to take elements from that large world, philosophical and cultural writings, and recast and quite literally reform the tradition. In a world like ours, where most of us and most of the people we serve are not the bearers of what I would call a thick Jewish culture that produced these men, but rather we are heirs to and live within a world of much thinner Jewish culture. It is an ongoing issue for us to talk about how we translate that heritage into 21st century terms. I do not think we can resolve that this evening, but I think these are issues. Well, I know we can't resolve it this evening, but I do think one of the great gifts that the society gives us is an ability to begin to reflect upon these questions, and hopefully we will be able to continue to discuss them. And we thank you again for being our provocateurs in allowing this conversation to take place. So I thank you for what has really been for me a wonderful day, and I'm very, very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you. inspire us and to learn from the past, and also to see the ways in which the courage of those who came before us can help us address some of the social justice issues that are confronting us in our world. And as the Society of Classical Reform Judaism evolved in its stance on, for example, Zionism and Israel, so too are all of us in our own ways evolving and growing, standing with those who came before us and learning from them and helping to make it relevant for the next century. I hope you'll all join us tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us.